Sometimes the most broken hearts find each other in the strangest places. When you've lost everyone you ever loved, you learn that kindness can come from the most unexpected sources. Old Jeremiah Pike found his German shepherds circling a freezing woman in the Montana snow. But they weren't attacking her, they were protecting her. The woman had been missing for days, lost and confused. Jeremiah was a loner who avoided people. But something about her and his dog's behavior touched something deep inside him. What happened next changed both their lives forever. But why did his hunting dogs choose to guard a stranger instead of hunt? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pine branches like a morning song, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. Jeremiah Pike pulled his wool coat tighter around his weathered frame as he stepped onto the porch of his log cabin, a structure he'd built with his own hands 20 years ago, when he'd first retreated to this remote corner of the Montana wilderness. The cabin sat perched on a ridge overlooking the Bitterroot Valley, far enough from civilization that he could go weeks without seeing another human soul exactly the way he preferred it. His worn leather journal lay open on the kitchen table inside, filled with decades of careful observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, and the changing seasons. Each entry written in his precise handwriting, documenting a life lived in deliberate solitude. The journal had become his confidant, the repository of thoughts he'd once shared with his beloved Sarah before the accident took her and their young daughter Emma away from him in a single devastating moment. The memory still cut through him like the mountain wind, even after all these years. Sarah's laugh echoing through their old farmhouse in the valley below, Emma's small hand in his as they walked through the meadow behind their home. Gone in an instant, when a drunk driver ran a red light on a rainy Tuesday evening. Jeremiah had sold the farm within a month, packed his few belongings, and disappeared into the mountains with nothing but his grief and a determination to never let his heart break again. But he hadn't come alone. 3 German shepherd puppies had been born on his farm just weeks before the accident, and he couldn't bear to leave them behind. Now grown into magnificent beasts, they were his only companions in this self-imposed exile. Kaiser, the alpha of the pack, stood nearly 30 inches at the shoulder, with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand his master's pain. Ranger, slightly smaller but fiercely loyal, had never left Jeremiah's side during those first terrible months of mourning. And Scout, the youngest, possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger or distress from miles away. The dogs moved around him now with practiced ease, their morning routine as established as his own. Kaiser padded to the edge of the porch and lifted his massive head, scanning the tree line with the vigilance of a seasoned sentinel. Ranger settled at Jeremiah's feet, his warm bulk a comforting presence against the cold morning air. Scout remained alert but restless, his ears pricked forward as if listening to something beyond human perception. Down in the valley, barely visible through the morning mist, lay the small community of Pine Ridge, a collection of ranches, a general store, and a church that served the scattered families who called this rugged country home. Jeremiah knew them all by reputation, though he'd spoken to precious few in all his years on the mountain. There was Doc Henderson, who'd treated everything from broken bones to difficult births for 40 years. Martha Clemens, who ran the general store and served as the unofficial town gossip and information hub. And the Reverend Thomas, whose sermons Jeremiah could sometimes hear, carried on the wind when he preached, with the church doors open during the warmer months. Among the valley families, none had captured his reluctant attention quite like the Cranes. Marcus Crane ran one of the larger cattle operations, a steady man in his 50s who'd inherited the ranch from his father. But it was Marcus's mother, Elspeth Crane, who had stirred something in Jeremiah's carefully guarded heart during the few times their paths had crossed. She'd been the schoolteacher in Pine Ridge for over 30 years before retiring, a woman whose kindness and gentle wisdom had shaped 2 generations of valley children. Elspeth had been widowed 5 years ago when her husband Thomas passed from a heart attack during spring roundup. The loss had hit her harder than anyone expected. What began as normal grief had gradually evolved into something more troubling. Her sharp mind, once capable of reciting entire poems from memory and solving complex mathematical problems in her head, had begun to show signs of wear. Words escaped her mid-sentence. She'd forget familiar faces or become confused about where she was. Marcus did his best to care for her, but running a ranch was demanding work that required long hours away from the house. He'd hired a housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, to stay with his mother during the day, but Elspeth's condition seemed to worsen as the seasons passed. She'd begun wandering, sometimes found miles from the ranch house with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The whole valley talked about it in hushed, sympathetic tones. Martha at the general store would shake her head sadly when discussing poor Elspeth's condition. Doc Henderson had gently suggested that Marcus might need to consider more specialized care, perhaps in one of those facilities in Missoula or Helena. But Marcus couldn't bear the thought of his mother living among strangers, and Elspeth herself became agitated whenever the subject was broached. Jeremiah knew about the family's struggles because news traveled fast in a small community, even to someone who tried his best to remain invisible. He'd see Marcus in town occasionally, the man's face etched with worry and exhaustion. Once, during a particularly harsh storm the previous winter, Jeremiah had spotted Elspeth walking along the creek bed below his cabin, clearly lost and confused. He'd watched through his binoculars as Marcus and a group of neighbors found her, wrapping her in blankets and gently leading her home. That incident had stirred something uncomfortable in Jeremiah's chest, a recognition of loss and helplessness that reminded him too much of his own grief. He'd tried to push the feeling away, to retreat further into his solitude, but the image of the elderly woman's confused face had haunted his dreams for weeks. Now, as he stood on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, Scout's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated. The dog whined softly, pacing between the porch and the edge of the clearing where the forest began. His ears were flattened against his head, and his nose worked constantly, testing the air for some scent that had captured his attention. "What is it, boy?" Jeremiah asked, his voice rough from disuse. He spoke to his dogs more than any human, and they seemed to understand him better than most people ever had. Scout turned toward him, dark eyes reflecting the pale light of dawn, then looked back toward the forest. Kaiser and Ranger had noticed their companion's distress and moved to flank him, all 3 dogs now focused on something beyond the tree line. Jeremiah stepped down from the porch and followed their gaze. The snow had fallen steadily for the past 2 days, blanketing the mountain in pristine white that muffled sound and transformed familiar landmarks into mysterious shapes. In the distance, he could make out the dark line of Pine Creek, which ran along the valley floor before eventually joining the Bitterroot River miles to the south. His dogs had never behaved this way without good reason. In 20 years of living together on the mountain, they'd developed an almost telepathic communication system. They'd alerted him to approaching bears, warned him of sudden weather changes, and once even led him to an injured hiker who'd fallen into a ravine 3 miles from the cabin. The wind shifted, bringing with it a new scent that made Scout whimper with something that sounded almost like urgency. Without another word, Jeremiah went back inside and pulled on his heavy boots, grabbed his thick winter coat, and picked up the walking stick he'd carved from a piece of oak years ago. If his dogs wanted to investigate something, he'd learned long ago to trust their instincts. The 3 German shepherds bounded ahead as they left the clearing around the cabin, their powerful bodies cutting through the deep snow with surprising grace. Jeremiah followed their trail, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he made his way down the familiar path that led toward the valley. 20 minutes into their descent, Scout suddenly stopped and raised his head, his entire body rigid with attention. Kaiser and Ranger immediately flanked him, and all three dogs began moving in a different direction, following a scent trail that led away from Jeremiah's usual paths and deeper into the forest. The snow here was deeper, untouched by human footprints, but marked with the tracks of various forest creatures. Jeremiah could identify the delicate prints of deer, the larger impressions left by elk, and the distinctive paw marks of the mountain cats that roamed these hills. But there was something else, a set of tracks that made his heart skip a beat. Human footprints, small and irregular, wandering through the forest without any apparent destination or purpose. They zigzagged between trees, doubled back on themselves, and seemed to grow increasingly erratic as they progressed deeper into the wilderness. His dogs had found the trail and were following it with single-minded determination. Jeremiah quickened his pace, a growing sense of urgency building in his chest. Someone was out here, lost in the snow and bitter cold, and from the look of the tracks, they'd been wandering for some time. The trail led them down a steep slope toward a small clearing near Pine Creek. As they approached, Jeremiah could hear the sound of running water where the creek had not yet frozen, and something else, a soft, barely audible sound that might have been singing or talking. He pushed through the last line of trees and stopped short at what he saw before him. In the center of the small clearing, surrounded by his 3 German shepherds, sat an elderly woman in a thin nightgown and house slippers. Her silver hair was tangled with snow and ice, her lips blue with cold, and her entire body shook with violent tremors. But the dogs weren't threatening her. They had arranged themselves in a protective circle around her, their bodies creating a windbreak against the brutal mountain air. Scout lay pressed against her side, his thick fur providing what warmth he could. Kaiser and Ranger remained alert but gentle, their eyes constantly scanning the perimeter for potential threats. The woman looked up as Jeremiah approached, her eyes clouded with confusion, but somehow still beautiful despite her distress. She smiled at him with heartbreaking sweetness, as if his appearance was the most natural thing in the world. "Oh, hello there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I seem to have gotten myself turned around. Do you know the way back to the schoolhouse? My students will be waiting for their morning lessons." Jeremiah's heart clenched at the sight of her, this fragile woman who clearly believed she was still teaching children, sitting in the snow as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. Elspeth Crane, the valley's beloved former schoolteacher, was dying of exposure mere miles from her son's ranch. "Mom," he said softly, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. "I'm Jeremiah Pike. These are my dogs, and they've been keeping you warm." Elspeth looked at the German shepherds with wonder, reaching out with trembling fingers to stroke Scout's thick fur. "Such beautiful children," she murmured. "Are they new students? They're very well behaved." The confusion in her voice cut through Jeremiah's carefully constructed emotional walls like a knife through paper. He'd spent 20 years avoiding exactly this kind of human connection, this vulnerability that came with caring about someone else's pain. But seeing her sitting there, lost in her own mind, while her body slowly succumbed to the brutal cold, something fundamental shifted inside his chest. He shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, feeling the violent tremors that racked her small frame. Her skin was frighteningly pale, almost translucent in the early morning light, and her lips had gone beyond blue to a dangerous purple that spoke of advanced hypothermia. "We need to get you somewhere warm," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Can you stand?" She looked up at him with eyes that seemed to flicker between confusion and startling clarity. "I was looking for the children," she said. "They get so worried when I'm late." Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile brought fresh apples for their afternoon snack. Mrs. Patterson had been dead for over a decade, Jeremiah knew. The Mercantile had closed years ago when Martha Clemens opened the general store. But Elspeth spoke of these things as if they'd happened yesterday, as if her mind had transported her back to a time when the world made perfect sense. "The children are safe. he said, surprising himself with how naturally the gentle lie came. "They're waiting somewhere warm. Let me help you get there." Kaiser rose to his feet and moved to Elspeth's other side, positioning himself so she could lean against his sturdy frame. The dog's intelligence never ceased to amaze Jeremiah somehow. Kaiser understood that this was a rescue operation, not a hunting expedition. With infinite care, Jeremiah helped Elspeth to her feet. She weighed almost nothing, her body so frail it seemed like she might blow away in the mountain wind. Her house slippers were soaked through and frozen to her feet, and he realized with growing alarm that she'd probably been wandering in the snow for most of the night. "My cabin isn't far," he said, wrapping one arm around her to support her weight. "We'll get you warmed up, and then we'll figure out how to get you home." The mention of home seemed to confuse her further. "But this is home," she said, looking around at the snow-covered forest with genuine affection. "Don't you think it's beautiful? Thomas always said the mountains in winter looked like God's own cathedral." Thomas, her late husband. Jeremiah felt a stab of recognition at the way she spoke of him, as if he were still alive, still sharing observations about the natural world with his beloved wife. It reminded him painfully of how he sometimes caught himself thinking about Sarah, forgetting for just a moment that she wasn't waiting for him back at the cabin. The journey back up the mountain took nearly an hour. Elspeth's strength faded rapidly, and several times Jeremiah had to stop and let her rest against him while she caught her breath. His dogs maintained their protective formation around them, Scout and Ranger ranging ahead to break trail, while Kaiser stayed close to provide additional support. During one of their rest stops, Elspeth suddenly gripped his arm with surprising strength. Her eyes cleared momentarily, and she looked directly at him with the sharp intelligence that had made her such a respected teacher. "You're the hermit," she said, not unkindly. "The one who lives up in the old trapper's cabin. People say you lost your family." The directness of her statement caught him off guard. He'd grown so accustomed to being invisible, to being discussed in whispers and speculation, that having someone address his tragedy so matter-of-factly felt both jarring and oddly liberating. "Yes, ma'am," he said simply. She studied his face with the careful attention she'd once given to her students' work. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. "Losing the people we love changes us in ways we never expect." Her moment of clarity was brief, and soon she was back to talking about her students and asking when the school bell would ring. But those few seconds of genuine connection had shaken something loose in Jeremiah's carefully guarded heart. By the time they reached the cabin, Elspeth was barely conscious. Jeremiah carried her up the porch steps and through the front door, his dogs following close behind. The interior of the cabin was Spartan but warm, heated by a wood-burning stove that he'd kept burning through the night. He settled her in the old leather armchair beside the stove, the same chair where he'd spent countless evenings reading by lamplight and trying to forget the sound of Sarah's laughter. Scout immediately curled up at Elspeth's feet, his body radiating warmth, while Kaiser and Ranger positioned themselves nearby. Jeremiah moved through his cabin with purposeful efficiency, gathering thick blankets, dry socks, and a pair of Sarah's old slippers that he'd never been able to bring himself to throw away. As he wrapped the blankets around Elspeth's shivering form, he found himself talking to her in the same gentle tone he'd once used with Emma during her bedtime stories. "You're safe now," he said, kneeling beside her chair to remove her frozen house slippers. Her feet were dangerously cold, the skin mottled and pale. He worked slowly and carefully, massaging warmth back into her toes while she drifted in and out of consciousness. "The children," she whispered, her eyes fluttering open. "Are they warm enough? Sometimes the schoolhouse gets so cold in winter." "They're all warm and safe," he assured her, continuing his gentle ministrations. "Every single one of them." As color slowly returned to her feet and hands, Jeremiah found himself studying her face. Even in her current state, he could see traces of the beauty she must have possessed as a young woman. More than that, he could see the kindness that had made her so beloved in the community, a gentleness that radiated from her, even in confusion. He prepared hot tea with honey and helped her drink it slowly, supporting her head with one hand while she sipped. The simple act of caring for another person felt foreign after so many years of solitude, yet somehow natural, as if some long dormant part of his soul was awakening after a deep sleep. "What's your name, dear?" Elspeth asked suddenly, looking at him with those remarkably blue eyes. "Jeremiah," he said. "Jeremiah Pike." She smiled, and for a moment her confusion seemed to lift entirely. "That's a good, strong name. Biblical. He was a prophet. You know, the weeping prophet. But he was also a man of great faith. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a woman whose mind was failing, offering theological comfort to a man who'd lost his faith along with his family. Yet something in her voice, some echo of the teacher she'd been, made him want to believe that perhaps redemption was still possible, even for someone who'd spent 20 years running from God and human connection. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the pine trees, but inside the cabin, something had fundamentally changed. The space that had been his refuge from the world now held another person, fragile, confused, but undeniably alive and present. And for the first time in 2 decades, Jeremiah Pike found himself responsible for someone other than himself. As Elspeth dozed fitfully in the chair, wrapped in blankets with his 3 German shepherds, keeping vigil around her, Jeremiah stood at the window and looked down toward the valley. Somewhere down there, Marcus Crane was probably organizing search parties, sick with worry about his missing mother. The decent thing to do would be to hike down the mountain and alert them immediately. But the storm was worsening, and Elspeth was in no condition to travel. More than that, something about this situation felt significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate, as if the universe had finally decided to force him out of his self-imposed exile by placing this broken, beautiful woman directly in his path. He reached for his worn leather journal and began to write, documenting not just the weather and wildlife observations that had filled its pages for 20 years, but the story of how 3 German shepherds had led him to discover that even the most carefully guarded heart could still be touched by unexpected grace. The storm raged for 3 days. Jeremiah had lived through countless mountain blizzards during his 20 years of solitude, but none had felt quite like this one. The wind howled with an almost personal fury, piling snow against the cabin walls until the windows were half buried and the world outside disappeared entirely. Under normal circumstances, he would have settled in with his dogs, his books, and his thoughts, waiting patiently for nature to exhaust herself. But nothing about these circumstances was normal. Elspeth Crane remained in his cabin, drifting between periods of confused wakefulness and deep, exhausted sleep. During her lucid moments, she would ask about her students, worry about lesson plans, or speak to her deceased husband as if he were sitting in the next chair. During her rest, Jeremiah found himself watching her with a fascination that disturbed his carefully cultivated indifference to human suffering. On the second morning, as he prepared breakfast over the wood-burning stove, she surprised him by appearing fully alert and present. "You have a beautiful home," she said, looking around the cabin with genuine appreciation. "Thomas would have loved all these books." Jeremiah glanced at the shelves that lined 2 walls of the main room, volumes on wildlife, forestry, philosophy, and literature that he'd accumulated over the years. Reading had become one of his primary escapes from loneliness, and he'd built quite an extensive library through mail-order catalogues and occasional trips to larger towns. "Your husband was a reader?" he asked, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before her. "Oh my, yes. He could spend entire evenings lost in a book about ranching techniques or Western history. Sometimes I'd have to call his name 3 times before he'd look up." She smiled at the memory, her eyes bright with affection. "He always said that books were like having conversations with the smartest people who ever lived." The observation struck Jeremiah as profoundly true. His books had indeed been his primary companions during these years of self-imposed exile, voices of wisdom and experience that asked nothing of him except attention. "I don't suppose you'd have anything by Robert Frost?" Elspeth asked hopefully. "He was always one of my favorites to teach." The children loved "The Road Not Taken," though they never quite understood what he was really saying about choice and consequence. Jeremiah rose and pulled a worn volume from the shelf, handing it to her with something approaching shyness. It had been years since he'd discussed literature with another person, and he'd forgotten how pleasurable such conversations could be. Elspeth opened the book reverently, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of "stopping by woods on a snowy evening." She began to recite from memory, her voice taking on the rhythm and cadence of someone who'd spent decades sharing poetry with young minds. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." She looked up at him with remarkable clarity. "Do you think he was talking about death? That final sleep?" The question hung between them like something tangible. Jeremiah had read those lines countless times during his darkest moments, when the isolation and grief had made him wonder if simply walking into the winter woods might be preferable to another day of remembering what he'd lost. "Maybe," he said carefully, "or maybe about the promises we make to keep living, even when we'd rather not." She studied his face with the intensity he was beginning to recognize as her teacher's instinct, the ability to see past surface answers to deeper truths. "You've thought about that final sleep, haven't you?" she said gently. "After you lost them." The directness of her question should have offended him, should have triggered his defensive retreat into silence and isolation. Instead, he found himself nodding slowly, acknowledging a truth he'd never spoken aloud to another human being. "Yes, ma'am, I have, but you kept your promises instead. You kept living." He looked around the cabin he'd built with his own hands, at the dogs who depended on him, at the journal where he'd recorded 20 years of observations about the natural world. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps survival itself was a kind of promise-keeping. "What promises are you keeping, Mrs. Crane?" he asked. Her moment of clarity began to fade, confusion creeping back into her beautiful blue eyes. "The children," she said uncertainly. "I have to take care of the children. They need someone to teach them about the world, about poetry and kindness, and how to be good to each other." It broke his heart to watch her mind slip away again, like seeing someone drowning in slow motion. But during her lucid intervals, he was beginning to understand why the entire valley spoke of her with such affection. There was something fundamentally nurturing about her presence, even in her diminished state. By the third day, practical concerns began to outweigh the strange comfort of their forced companionship. The storm was finally beginning to abate, and Jeremiah knew he had to make contact with the outside world. Marcus Crane would be frantic with worry, and the longer Elspeth remained missing, the more desperate her son would become. His old ham radio, a relic from his early days on the mountain, crackled to life after some coaxing. The emergency frequency buzzed with activity search and rescue teams, volunteers, and the unmistakable voice of Marcus Crane coordinating efforts to find his mother. "This is KD7HQR, Jeremiah transmitted, using his call sign for the first time in years. "I have Elspeth Crane at my location. She's safe, but needs medical attention." The response was immediate and intense. Marcus's voice, tight with emotion and exhaustion, crackled through the static. "Where are you?" "Is she hurt? We've been searching for 3 days. Mountain cabin on the north ridge above Pine Creek," Jeremiah replied. "She's hypothermic but stable." "Road conditions?" "Impassable. We'll need snowmobiles or the helicopter from Missoula. Can you keep her safe until we can reach you?" Jeremiah looked at Elspeth, who was dozing peacefully in his chair, while Scout kept watch beside her. The question struck him as both practical and profound. Could he keep her safe? Could anyone keep someone safe whose mind was betraying them at every turn? "Yes," he said simply, "I can keep her safe. As he signed off the radio, Jeremiah realized he'd just made a commitment that extended beyond the immediate rescue. For the first time in 20 years, he'd voluntarily connected himself to another person's welfare, taken responsibility for someone else's well-being. The implications terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. That evening, as they shared a simple dinner by lamplight, Elspeth surprised him again with a moment of perfect clarity. "You know," she said, cutting her meat with careful precision, "loneliness is like a kind of cold that settles in your bones. You can pile on all the blankets you want, but the chill stays with you until someone else's warmth helps drive it away." She looked at him directly, and he saw in her eyes not confusion, but profound understanding. "Thank you for sharing your warmth with me, Jeremiah. I know it hasn't been easy." Outside, the wind was finally dying down, and through the cabin windows he could see the first stars appearing in the clearing sky. Soon the rescue teams would arrive, and this strange interlude would end. Elspeth would return to her son's ranch, and he would resume his solitary existence on the mountain. But something fundamental had changed during these 3 days. The cold that had settled in his bones 20 years ago had begun, almost imperceptibly, to thaw. The rescue helicopter arrived at dawn on the 4th day, its rotors cutting through the mountain air with mechanical precision that seemed almost violent after the natural quiet of the storm. Jeremiah stood on his porch with his dogs, watching as the aircraft circled his clearing before settling down in a whirlwind of snow and noise. Marcus Crane was the first person out, followed by Doc Henderson and 2 paramedics from the Missoula medical team. Marcus looked like he'd aged a decade in the 4 days his mother had been missing. His face was haggard with exhaustion and worry, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Inside," Jeremiah replied, stepping aside to let them pass. "She's been drifting in and out, but she's warm and fed." He watched from the doorway as Marcus knelt beside his mother's chair, taking her small hands in his weathered rancher's grip. Elspeth looked up at him with mild confusion, as if trying to place his familiar face in the context of her fragmented memories. "Hello, dear," she said politely. "Are you here about the school? I'm afraid we're not having classes today due to the weather." The pain that flashed across Marcus's features was almost unbearable to witness. Jeremiah found himself looking away, giving the man privacy for his grief over his mother's deteriorating condition. Doc Henderson worked with quiet efficiency, checking Elspeth's vital signs and examining her feet for frostbite damage. The old physician had been serving the valley community for 4 decades, and his gentle bedside manner seemed to calm her confusion. "No permanent damage," he announced after his examination. "Another few hours in that cold would have been a different story, but she'll be fine physically." The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air that while her body had been saved, her mind continued its relentless decline. One of the paramedics approached Jeremiah with professional courtesy. "Sir, we need to ask you some questions about how you found her and what kind of care you've been providing." For the next 30 minutes, Jeremiah found himself recounting the events of the past 4 days to a growing audience of rescue personnel and medical professionals. He described finding her in the snow, the behavior of his dogs, the 3 days of storm that had kept them confined to the cabin. What he didn't describe was the poetry she'd recited from memory, the moments of startling clarity when she'd seen straight into his soul, or the way her presence had begun to fill spaces in his heart that had been empty for 20 years. "You probably saved her life," one of the paramedics said. "Hypothermia in someone her age, with her condition, she wouldn't have lasted the night out there." Marcus approached him as the medical team prepared Elspeth for transport. The rancher's handshake was firm, his gratitude unmistakable, but tinged with something deeper recognition, perhaps, of the significance of what had transpired. "I don't know how to thank you," Marcus said. "When we couldn't find her after the first night, I started preparing for the worst." "Your dogs," Elspeth called out suddenly from her stretcher, her voice cutting through the noise of preparation. "Where are your beautiful dogs?" Jeremiah whistled softly, and Kaiser, Scout, and Ranger padded over to her side. She reached out with trembling fingers to stroke their fur, her face lighting up with genuine joy. "They're such good children," she said to the assembled crowd. "They took such wonderful care of me, better than any people ever could." The comment drew smiles from the rescue team, but Jeremiah heard something more in her words, a recognition of the pure, uncomplicated loyalty that animals offered, the kind of love that asked nothing in return except presence and attention. As they loaded her into the helicopter, Elspeth suddenly gripped his hand with surprising strength. Her eyes cleared momentarily, and she looked at him with the focused intensity he was beginning to treasure. "Don't go back to hiding," she said urgently. "Promise me you won't go back to hiding from life." The helicopter lifted off before he could respond, carrying her away from his mountain sanctuary and back to the complications of the valley below. But her words echoed in his mind, long after the sound of rotors had faded into silence. That evening, alone again in his cabin for the first time in days, Jeremiah found the space felt different, larger somehow, yet also emptier. The chair where she'd sat still held the impression of her small frame, and Scout kept returning to sniff at the spot where she'd rested her feet. He opened his leather journal and began to write, trying to capture something of what had occurred during those 4 days. But words seemed inadequate to describe the subtle transformation he'd experienced, the way her presence had somehow given him permission to feel things he'd kept buried for 2 decades. 2 days later, Marcus Crane made the difficult journey up the mountain on horseback, arriving at the cabin just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks. He carried with him a thermos of coffee and a determination to have a conversation that Jeremiah suspected he'd been dreading. "How is she?" Jeremiah asked, offering Marcus a seat on the porch despite the cold. "Physically, she's fine. Mentally," Marcus shook his head, his frustration evident. "Doc Henderson says the wandering episodes are going to get worse. He's recommending a memory care facility in Missoula." The words hit Jeremiah with unexpected force. The thought of Elspeth confined to some institutional setting, surrounded by strangers who couldn't appreciate her moments of clarity or her gentle wisdom, seemed fundamentally wrong. "She hates the idea," Marcus continued, "gets agitated every time we bring it up. But I can't watch her 24 hours a day, and Missus Rodriguez is getting too old to handle her when she gets confused and tries to leave." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, Marcus spoke the words that Jeremiah had been both expecting and dreading. "She keeps asking about you, about your dogs. It's the only time she seems really calm and happy, when she's talking about her time up here." Jeremiah felt something tighten in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've been thinking about alternatives to the memory care facility, and I'm wondering if a man who's spent 20 years living alone on a mountain might consider some company." The proposal hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they wanted to cross. It would mean the end of Jeremiah's carefully maintained isolation, the dismantling of the protective walls he'd built around his heart. It would mean responsibility, vulnerability, and the constant possibility of loss. But it would also mean that Elspeth wouldn't spend her remaining lucid moments surrounded by strangers in an institutional setting. It would mean she could continue to find comfort in the presence of his dogs, could sit by his fire and recite poetry from memory on the days when her mind allowed it. "I need time to think," Jeremiah said finally. Marcus nodded, understanding that he was asking a man to fundamentally reshape his entire existence. "Take all the time you need, but don't take too long. She's asking for you every day." For 2 weeks after Marcus's visit, Jeremiah's routine became a battleground between old habits and new possibilities. He would wake each morning and go through the familiar motions of tending his dogs, checking the weather, and recording observations in his leather journal. But now, every mundane activity felt charged with potential significance. The chair where Elspeth had sat remained exactly as she'd left it, though Scout had claimed permanent residence at its base, as if waiting for her return. Jeremiah found himself glancing at it throughout the day, remembering fragments of their conversations and feeling an unfamiliar ache of loneliness that had nothing to do with missing Sarah and Emma. This was different, a present-tense longing for someone who was still alive but absent, someone whose company he'd discovered he genuinely enjoyed. The realization troubled him deeply. For 20 years, he'd built his identity around being someone who needed no one, who could find sufficient meaning in solitude and the natural world. But Elspeth's presence had revealed the lie in that carefully constructed narrative. On a crystalline morning in late February, he made a decision that surprised even him. He saddled his old gelding, Murphy, and rode down into the valley for the first time in over 3 years. The journey felt surreal, familiar landmarks that he'd observed from a distance for decades, now viewed up close. The community he'd deliberately avoided for so long spread out before him in all its modest complexity. Pine Ridge hadn't changed much. The general store still occupied its central position on Main Street, flanked by the post office and Doc Henderson's clinic. The church steeple rose above the scattered collection of homes and businesses, its white paint gleaming in the winter sunlight. But what struck Jeremiah most forcefully was how normal everything appeared. He'd spent so many years viewing the valley from his mountain perch, imagining the lives being lived below him, that seeing actual people going about their daily business felt almost anticlimactic. He tied Murphy outside Martha Clemens's general store and steeled himself for human interaction. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Martha looked up from her inventory with the practiced smile of a long-time shopkeeper. Her expression shifted to one of genuine surprise when she recognized him. "Well, I'll be," she said, setting down her clipboard. "Jeremiah Pike. As I live and breathe. Haven't seen you in town for, my goodness, must be going on 4 years. 3.5, he corrected automatically, then felt foolish for the precision. Martha had the good grace not to comment on his exactness. Instead, she studied him with the frank curiosity that came with being the unofficial information hub of a small community. "Heard you were the one who found Elspeth Crane during that last storm," she said. "Town's been talking about nothing else. That was a good thing you did, taking care of her like that." Jeremiah nodded uncomfortably, unused to being the subject of community discussion. "How's she doing?" "About what you'd expect, some days better than others." Marcus is beside himself trying to figure out what to do. Martha leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think he's hoping you might have some ideas about that." The comment confirmed what Jeremiah had suspected, that Marcus's proposal hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision, but something he'd been considering carefully, possibly discussing with others in the community. He purchased the supplies he needed and made his way to Doc Henderson's clinic, driven by a need to understand more about Elspeth's condition. The old physician welcomed him warmly, gesturing him into the small office behind the examination rooms. "I was wondering when you'd make your way down here," Doc Henderson said, settling behind his desk with a cup of coffee. "Marcus mentioned he'd talk to you about his mother." "I need to understand what I'd be taking on," Jeremiah said directly. "What her condition really means, day to day." Doc Henderson nodded approvingly. "That's a fair question, and I respect you for asking it straight. Elspeth has what we call mixed dementia, some Alzheimer's, some vascular dementia from small strokes. Her memory comes and goes, but she's not violent or aggressive like some folks with the condition." He pulled out a thick medical file and opened it on the desk between them. "She has good days when she's almost like her old self, and bad days when she doesn't recognize Marcus or remember where she is. The wandering episodes are the biggest safety concern, especially as winter weather continues." "Is it getting worse?" "Gradually, yes. This isn't something that gets better, Jeremiah. Over time, she'll have fewer good days and more confusion. But she could have months or even years of meaningful quality of life, especially in an environment where she feels safe and cared for." The doctor leaned back in his chair, studying Jeremiah's face carefully. The question isn't whether you can cure her or stop the progression. The question is whether you can give her comfort and dignity while she still has lucid moments to appreciate it. That afternoon, Jeremiah found himself at the Crane Ranch, standing on the front porch with his hat in his hands like a nervous suitor. Marcus answered the door with a mixture of hope and apprehension on his weathered features. "Come in," Marcus said. "She's having a good day today. Actually asked if I thought you might visit." The ranch house was warm and comfortable, filled with the accumulated possessions of 3 generations of Crane family life. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, wedding pictures, children's school portraits, family gatherings that spoke of deep roots and enduring connections. Elspeth sat in a rocking chair by the front window, a blanket across her lap and a book open in her hands. She looked up as he entered, and her face brightened with immediate recognition and genuine pleasure. "Jeremiah!" she exclaimed, setting aside her book. "How wonderful to see you! I was just reading some Frost and thinking about our conversation. Do you remember? About promises and the miles we have to travel before we rest." The clarity in her voice and the warmth of her greeting struck him with unexpected force. This was the woman whose company he'd grown to cherish during those 4 storm-bound days, intelligent, kind, fully present in the moment. "I remember," he said, settling into a chair Marcus indicated. "What are you reading today?" "The Gift Outright," she said, holding up the book. "The poem Frost read at Kennedy's inauguration. The land was ours before we were the land's." She looked out the window at the snow-covered ranch land stretching toward the mountains. "Sometimes I think about that line and wonder if maybe we belong to places as much as they belong to us." They talked for nearly an hour about poetry, about the changing seasons, about the wildlife she could see from her window. Her mind remained sharp and engaged throughout the conversation, and Jeremiah found himself remembering why he'd been so drawn to her company. But as the afternoon wore on, he began to notice subtle signs of the confusion Doc Henderson had described. She repeated certain stories, asked questions she'd already asked, occasionally addressed him as Thomas before correcting herself with an apologetic smile. When it came time to leave, she walked him to the door with Marcus following behind. As Jeremiah pulled on his coat, she reached out and touched his arm gently. "I hope you'll come back soon," she said. "It gets lonely sometimes, especially in the evenings when I can't quite remember where I am or why Thomas isn't here to read to me." The simple honesty of her statement, the acknowledgement of her own confusion and fear cut through his defenses, more effectively than any argument Marcus could have made. On the ride back up the mountain, Jeremiah found himself facing a truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. He'd already made his decision, probably during those first few days when he'd cared for her in his cabin. Everything since then, the discussions with Marcus and Doc Henderson, the visit to see her at the ranch, had simply been his mind catching up with what his heart already knew. That evening, he opened his leather journal and wrote a single sentence. "Some promises are made not with words but with actions, and once made, they change everything that comes after." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early March, delivered by Martha Clemens herself, who had driven up the mountain in her old pickup truck with a determination that impressed even Jeremiah's German shepherds. Scout barked once in warning, then settled back on the porch, as if recognizing that this visitor posed no threat. "Special delivery," Martha announced, climbing out of her truck with more agility than her 73 years should have allowed. "From the State Health Department in Helena. Figured you'd want to see it sooner rather than later." Jeremiah accepted the official envelope with growing apprehension. He'd been expecting some kind of formal communication ever since word had spread through the valley about his plans to care for Elspeth, but the reality of government scrutiny still made his stomach tighten. "They've been asking questions," Martha continued, not bothering to disguise her curiosity. "Social services people, talking about home care regulations and whatnot." Seems someone thinks an old bachelor living alone on a mountain might not be suitable for caring for a woman with dementia. The letter confirmed his worst fears. The state required licensed caregivers, safety inspections, medical oversight, and a dozen other bureaucratic hurdles that seemed designed to prevent exactly the kind of arrangement he and Marcus had discussed. The language was polite but firm. Elspeth Crane would need to be placed in an approved facility unless her family could demonstrate compliance with state care standards. "Damn fools," Martha said, reading his expression, if not the letter itself. As if some institution in Missoula is going to take better care of her than someone who already proved he could keep her safe during a blizzard. But Jeremiah knew the regulations weren't entirely unreasonable. Caring for someone with dementia required skills and knowledge he didn't possess. What if she fell and injured herself? What if her condition deteriorated more rapidly than expected? What if his own inexperience led to tragedy? That afternoon, he rode down to the Crane Ranch to discuss the situation with Marcus. He found the rancher in the barn, mending tack with the methodical patience of someone who'd learned to find solace in routine work during difficult times. "Got a visit from social services yesterday," Marcus said without preamble, not looking up from the bridle he was repairing. "They're not impressed with our plan. I got their letter this morning." Marcus set aside his work and turned to face him directly. "They want to move her to that memory care place in Missoula by the end of the month. Say it's for her own safety and welfare." The words hung between them like a challenge. Jeremiah found himself remembering Elspeth's face during his recent visit, the way she'd lit up when discussing poetry, the gentle confusion when she'd asked about her deceased husband, the quiet dignity with which she'd acknowledged her own failing memory. "There might be another way," Jeremiah said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke. "What if we could meet their requirements?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You mean get licensed as a caregiver? That would take months, maybe a year of training and certification." "Not me. But what if we brought the licensed care to the mountain?" The plan that emerged over the next several days was ambitious, bordering on impossible, but it had the virtue of offering hope where none had existed before. Jeremiah would modify his cabin to meet safety standards, installing grab bars, improving lighting, adding a medical alert system. Marcus would hire a licensed practical nurse to live on the mountain part-time, rotating shifts with family members and volunteers from the community. Most importantly, they would transform Elspeth's care from an isolated arrangement into a community effort. Doc Henderson agreed to make regular house calls. Martha Clemens volunteered to help with meals and companionship. Even Reverend Thomas offered to visit regularly, knowing how much Elspeth had always appreciated theological discussions. But the centerpiece of the plan remained unchanged. Elspeth would live in the mountain cabin where she'd already demonstrated she could find peace and comfort, surrounded by the dogs who had first protected her and the man who had discovered he could no longer bear the thought of returning to complete solitude. The modifications to the cabin took 3 weeks to complete. Marcus organized work crews of volunteers from the valley, men who brought their tools and skills up the mountain to help create a space suitable for caring for their former schoolteacher. They widened doorways, installed safety equipment, and built a small addition that could serve as quarters for the rotating caregivers. Jeremiah watched the transformation of his sanctuary with mixed emotions. The cabin that had been his private refuge for 20 years now buzzed with activity and purpose. Strangers tracked mud across floors he'd kept pristine, moved furniture he'd positioned with deliberate care, and filled his quiet spaces with conversation and laughter. Yet something about the change felt right, in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The cabin was becoming something it had never been before, a home designed not for hiding from life, but for embracing it, even in its most challenging forms. Sarah Rodriguez, the licensed practical nurse Marcus had hired, arrived on a cold Thursday morning to assess the living arrangements. She was a compact woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and the practical competence that came from years of caring for elderly patients. "I've worked in plenty of facilities," she told Jeremiah as they toured the modified cabin. "Most of them are clean and safe and utterly soul-crushing. This," she gestured toward the books lining the walls, the view of the mountains through the picture windows, the dogs sleeping peacefully by the fireplace. "This is something different." She spent an hour reviewing the care plan, asking detailed questions about medications, emergency procedures, and daily routines. Her assessment was thorough, but not discouraging. "It can work," she concluded, "but you need to understand what you're signing up for. Some days will be harder than others. Some days she won't remember your name or why she's here. Some days she might be frightened or angry or desperately sad." Jeremiah nodded, thinking of his own experience with grief and the long journey toward acceptance. "I understand. Do you? Because caring for someone with dementia isn't just about keeping them fed and safe. It's about finding ways to honor who they were, even as they're losing pieces of who they are. It's about loving someone who might not always be able to love you back." The words struck him with unexpected force. For 20 years, he'd avoided exactly that kind of vulnerable, potentially unrequited care. His love for Sarah and Emma had been mutual, reciprocal, built on shared experiences and common purpose. What Sarah Rodriguez was describing required a different kind of courage, the willingness to give without guarantee of receiving anything in return. "She's coming home tomorrow," Marcus announced that evening as they shared coffee on the newly expanded porch. "Social services approved the arrangement, at least on a trial basis. If everything goes well for the next 6 months, they'll consider it permanent." Home. The word resonated in Jeremiah's mind as he looked out over the valley, where lights were beginning to twinkle in windows across the scattered ranches. For the first time in 2 decades, he was about to share his home with another person, not temporarily during an emergency, but as a deliberate choice that would reshape the fundamental nature of his existence. That night, he opened his leather journal and wrote, "Tomorrow, solitude ends and something else begins. I don't know what to call it yet, but I suspect it has something to do with the difference between existing and living." Elspeth returned to the mountain on a warm afternoon in late March, when the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the lower elevations. Sarah Rodriguez drove her up in Marcus's truck, with Kaiser, Scout and Ranger running alongside like an honor guard welcoming their charge back home. The reunion was everything Jeremiah had hoped it would be. Elspeth's face brightened with genuine recognition and joy as she saw the dogs, and she settled into her familiar chair by the fireplace as if she'd never left. For the first week, her lucid moments far outnumbered her confused periods, and the routine they established felt almost effortless. Sarah Rodriguez worked 12-hour shifts, providing professional medical oversight while allowing Jeremiah to maintain his primary caregiving role. During her off hours, various community members took turns visiting Martha Clemens, bringing fresh-baked bread and local gossip, Doc Henderson checking vital signs and adjusting medications, Reverend Thomas engaging Elspeth in theological discussions that seemed to bring her tremendous comfort. But it was during the quiet evening hours, when the professional caregivers had gone home and the visitors had departed, that Jeremiah discovered the profound satisfaction of simply being present for another person. He would read aloud from her favorite poetry while she dozed in her chair, or sit quietly beside her as she gazed out the window at the changing mountain landscape. "You know," she said one evening during a moment of perfect clarity, "I never expected to find peace in a place like this. But there's something about being up here that makes the confusion less frightening." "What do you mean?" he asked. "When I'm down in the valley, surrounded by all the familiar places and people, the forgetting feels like failure, like I'm disappointing everyone by not being who I used to be." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "But up here, with you and the dogs and all this beautiful wilderness, the forgetting feels more natural somehow, like maybe it's okay to let some things go." Her words stayed with him long after she'd fallen asleep, and he found himself thinking about the difference between loss as tragedy and loss as natural transition. Perhaps there was wisdom in her acceptance that he'd never quite managed to achieve regarding his own grief. 3 weeks into their new routine, everything changed. It began with a phone call from Helena. Sarah Rodriguez took the call in the small room they designated as the medical station, and Jeremiah could tell from her tone that something was seriously wrong. She emerged from the room with a grim expression and asked to speak with him privately on the porch. "There's been a complaint filed against our care arrangement," she said without preamble. "Someone's alleged that Mrs. Crane is being held against her will, that she's been isolated from her family and community for financial gain." The accusation was so absurd that Jeremiah's first reaction was disbelief. Financial gain? I'm not taking any money for her care. If anything, this arrangement is costing Marcus a fortune in medical supplies and professional nursing. I know that, and you know that, but the complaint has triggered a formal investigation. Social services will be here tomorrow to interview Mrs. Crane and assess the situation. Who would file such a complaint? Sarah shook her head. They wouldn't tell me, but they mentioned something about a concerned family member who believes Mrs. Crane would receive better care in a professional facility. That evening, as Jeremiah sat with Elspeth during her dinner, she seemed to sense his distraction. Her mind was particularly clear that day, and she studied his face with the perceptive attention he'd come to appreciate. "Something's troubling you," she said. It wasn't a question. He considered protecting her from the situation, but something about her steady gaze convinced him she deserved honesty. He explained about the complaint and the pending investigation, watching her expression shift from confusion to something approaching anger. "A family member?" she repeated. "But Marcus supports this arrangement completely." "That's what I thought too." She was quiet for several minutes, absently stroking Scout's fur as the dog rested his head on her lap. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that suggested painful memories. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I should have mentioned before, but the timing never seemed right." She explained that Marcus wasn't her only child. She'd had a daughter, Rebecca, who had moved to California 20 years earlier after a bitter dispute with her father over the ranch operation. Rebecca had wanted to modernize, to expand into tourism and guest ranching, while Thomas Crane had insisted on maintaining traditional cattle operations. The family conflict had escalated until Rebecca left Montana entirely, starting a successful real estate business in San Diego. She'd maintained minimal contact with her parents over the years, visiting perhaps once every 2 or 3 years for brief, tense encounters that pleased no one. "She called Marcus last month," Elspeth continued, her voice growing tired. "Said she'd heard about my condition and wanted to discuss options. Marcus told her about our arrangement here, and she became very upset." "Upset about what?" "About the money. Rebecca's always assumed she'd inherit half of the ranch when I pass away. But if I require expensive long-term care, especially private care like this, it could consume most of the estate." Elspeth looked out the window at the mountain landscape she'd come to love. "She thinks I should be in the cheapest possible facility, so there's more inheritance left for her and Marcus to split." The revelation recontextualized everything. The complaint hadn't been filed out of concern for Elspeth's welfare, but out of concern for potential inheritance. Rebecca Crane, who had barely maintained contact with her mother for 2 decades, was now attempting to control the circumstances of her care from 1,500 miles away. "There's more," Elspeth said quietly. "Rebecca's threatening to petition the court for guardianship. As my daughter, she could argue that she has more legal standing than Marcus to make decisions about my care, especially if she can convince a judge that this arrangement is somehow inappropriate or exploitative." The implications struck Jeremiah like a physical blow. A guardianship battle could drag on for months, during which Elspeth would likely be placed in temporary state custody. Even if Marcus ultimately prevailed, the legal fees and emotional trauma could destroy the family and certainly end any possibility of Elspeth remaining on the mountain. "Why didn't you tell me about Rebecca before?" he asked. because I hoped she wouldn't interfere, because I thought maybe, for once, she might put my happiness ahead of her financial interests. Elspeth's voice carried the deep sadness of a mother who had long since given up expecting better from a difficult child. I should have known better. That night, after Elspeth had gone to bed and Sarah Rodriguez had settled into her quarters, Jeremiah found himself pacing the porch like a caged animal. For 20 years, he'd avoided exactly this kind of complicated human drama, the messy intersection of family dynamics, legal requirements, and competing interests that made caring about other people so dangerous. Part of him wanted to withdraw from the situation entirely, to tell Marcus that the arrangement had become too complicated and that perhaps the memory care facility in Missoula really was the best option. It would be the safe choice, the predictable choice, the kind of choice that had protected his heart for 2 decades. But as he looked through the window at Elspeth sleeping peacefully in the bedroom they'd prepared for her, surrounded by his dogs who had appointed themselves her permanent guardians, he realized that safety was no longer his primary concern. The woman sleeping in his cabin had taught him something fundamental about the nature of love and commitment. She'd shown him that caring for another person wasn't about receiving guarantees or avoiding complications. It was about choosing to stay present even when the outcome was uncertain. Tomorrow, social services would arrive to investigate the complaint. Within days, Rebecca Crane might appear with lawyers and court papers. The peaceful routine they'd established could be shattered by forces entirely beyond their control. But tonight, Elspeth was safe and comfortable, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being rather than her estate value. And for the first time in 20 years, Jeremiah Pike was prepared to fight not just for his own peace of mind, but for someone else's right to live and die with dignity in the place where she'd found happiness. He opened his leather journal and wrote, "Some battles choose us rather than the other way around. Tomorrow we discover whether love is stronger than law, and whether a community's care can prevail over a stranger's greed." The social services investigation began at 8 o'clock the following morning with the arrival of 2 state officials in a government sedan that looked painfully out of place against the rugged mountain backdrop. Sandra Mills, the lead investigator, was a thin woman in her 50s with the efficient demeanor of someone who'd seen every variety of family dysfunction imaginable. Her partner, David Chen, appeared younger and less cynical, taking careful notes as they toured the modified cabin. Jeremiah watched their faces as they examined the safety modifications, reviewed medical records, and interviewed Sarah Rodriguez about care protocols. Their expressions remained professionally neutral, but he caught glimpses of what might have been approval as they noted the quality of the accommodations and the thoroughness of the medical oversight. The crucial moment came when they spoke with Elspeth herself. Jeremiah had worried about how she might respond to questioning from strangers, whether the stress might trigger confusion or agitation. But when Sandra Mills sat down across from her in the living room, Elspeth was remarkably composed and articulate. "Mrs. Crane," Mills began gently, "we need to ask you some questions about your living situation here. Do you understand why we're visiting today?" "I assume someone has complained about my being here," Elspeth replied, with startling directness. "Probably my daughter Rebecca, who seems to think I should be warehoused in some facility where I'd be cheaper to maintain." The bluntness of her response clearly caught both investigators off guard. Mills recovered quickly, consulting her notes before continuing. "Are you here voluntarily, Mrs. Crane? Do you feel free to leave if you wanted to?" "Young lady," Elspeth said with a trace of her old teacher's authority, "I'm 79 years old and my mind is failing me a little more each day. But I'm not a prisoner, and I'm not incompetent. I chose to come here because this man and his dogs saved my life, and because I found more peace on this mountain in 3 weeks than I had in 3 years down in the valley." She gestured toward the window where Kaiser and Scout were visible, patrolling the perimeter of the property with their usual vigilance. "Those dogs protected me when I was lost and confused. This man cared for me when I was half frozen and completely helpless. Why on earth would I want to leave the first place where I've felt truly safe since my husband died? Mills made careful notes, then asked about the medical care, the daily routines, and Elspeth's relationship with her family. Throughout the interview, Elspeth remained clear and cogent, displaying none of the confusion that sometimes clouded her thinking. After the investigators left, promising to file their report within a week, an uneasy calm settled over the mountain cabin. But Jeremiah knew the real test was yet to come. Rebecca Crane would not be deterred by a favorable social services report, especially if significant inheritance money remained at stake. His suspicions proved correct 3 days later when Marcus arrived at the cabin carrying a manila envelope and wearing the expression of a man who'd received devastating news. "Legal papers," Marcus announced without preamble, dropping the envelope on the kitchen table. "Rebecca's petitioning for emergency guardianship. She's claiming I'm unfit to make decisions about Mom's care because I'm allowing her to live in an isolated, inappropriate environment with an unlicensed individual." Jeremiah scanned the legal documents, noting the formal language that transformed their caring arrangement into something sinister and exploitative. Rebecca's attorney had painted a picture of elder abuse, financial manipulation, and family members who were either complicit or incompetent. "There's more," Marcus continued grimly. "She's flying in from California tomorrow with her lawyer. They want to have Mum evaluated by their own physician and moved to a secure facility pending the court's decision." "What does that mean?" "Practically speaking, it means we have maybe 48 hours before they try to take her away from here, possibly by force if necessary." That evening, as they sat around the fireplace after Elspeth had gone to bed, an impromptu war council convened in the cabin. Marcus had called in reinforcements. Doc Henderson, Martha Clemens, Sarah Rodriguez, and even Reverend Thomas had made the difficult journey up the mountain to discuss strategy. "The law's on their side, unfortunately," admitted Doc Henderson, who had dealt with similar family disputes during his 4 decades of practice. "A daughter has legal standing to petition for guardianship, especially if she can demonstrate that the current arrangement is somehow harmful or inappropriate." "But it's not harmful," Sarah Rodriguez protested. "Mrs. Crane is receiving better care here than she would in most institutions. Her medical needs are being met, she's emotionally stable, and her quality of life is obviously improved. That may not matter if Rebecca can convince a judge that the situation is irregular," Reverend Thomas said sadly. "The legal system tends to favor institutional care for elderly individuals with cognitive impairment, regardless of the quality of alternatives." Martha Clemens, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the discussion, suddenly leaned forward with the intensity that made her such an effective community organizer. "What if we could demonstrate that this isn't just Jeremiah caring for Elspeth in isolation?" she asked. "What if we could show that the entire community is involved in her care, that she's not isolated, but actually more connected to people than she would be in some facility in Missoula?" The idea sparked immediate interest around the room. Over the next 2 hours, they developed a plan that was ambitious, risky, and entirely dependent on the willingness of the Pine Ridge community to rally around their former schoolteacher. "We'll need documentation," Doc Henderson said, pulling out a small notebook. "Medical records showing improvement in her condition since she's been here. Testimony from community members about their involvement in her care. Evidence that this arrangement is not only safe, but actually beneficial." "And we'll need witnesses," added Reverend Thomas. "People who can testify to Elspeth's mental state, her expressed preferences, and her quality of life here versus what it was before." Martha was already making lists. "I can contact everyone who's been involved in the care rotation. Mrs. Anderson from the post office, the Hendricks family who brought groceries last week, Tom Bradley who helped with the cabin modifications. If Rebecca wants to argue that Elspeth is isolated, we'll show her exactly how wrong she is." But even as they planned their defense, Jeremiah felt a growing sense of unease. They were essentially preparing for a battle between two fundamentally different philosophies of care, one based on institutional safety and legal protection, the other on community support and individual choice. The next morning brought Rebecca Crane to the mountain for the first time in over 5 years. She arrived in a rented SUV, accompanied by a sharp-dressed attorney from Helena, both looking profoundly out of place in the wilderness setting. Jeremiah's first impression of Rebecca was of someone who had spent years cultivating an image of urban sophistication. She was impeccably dressed, meticulously groomed, and radiated the kind of professional confidence that came from success in competitive business environments. But there was something brittle about her composure, a quality that suggested her self-assurance might be more performance than genuine confidence. "You must be Mr. Pike," she said, extending a manicured hand with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to making favorable first impressions. "I'm Rebecca Crane, Elspeth's daughter. I want to thank you for taking care of my mother during her crisis, but I think it's time we discussed more appropriate long-term arrangements." Her tone was polite but firm, carrying the implicit assumption that her arrival marked the end of what she clearly considered a temporary and misguided experiment in home care. "Your mother seems quite happy with the current arrangements," Jeremiah replied carefully. "My mother has dementia," Rebecca said, her professional facade slipping slightly. "She's not competent to make decisions about her own welfare. That's why the family needs to step in and ensure she receives proper professional care. I am competent enough to know when someone's talking about me as if I'm not in the room." The voice came from behind them, clear and firm despite the early morning hour. Elspeth stood in the doorway of the cabin, fully dressed and alert, with Scout at her side like a furry bodyguard. The reunion between mother and daughter was awkward and tense, marked by stilted conversation and carefully avoided topics. Rebecca's attorney, meanwhile, began documenting everything: the cabin's layout, the medical equipment, the presence of the dogs, and most importantly, any signs of Elspeth's cognitive impairment. As the morning progressed, Jeremiah realized they were witnessing more than a family dispute about care. Arrangements. This was a clash between two entirely different ways of understanding what it meant to live with dignity in the face of loss and decline. Rebecca saw her mother's condition as a problem to be managed efficiently and cost-effectively, with success measured by safety standards and legal compliance. Elspeth herself, along with Jeremiah and the community that had rallied around her, saw her situation as an opportunity to demonstrate that love and care could take forms that no institution could replicate. By afternoon, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Rebecca and her attorney had made their position clear: Elspeth would be moved to a certified memory care facility within the week, regardless of her personal preferences or the quality of care she was currently receiving. The community's response was swift and decisive. Cars and trucks began arriving at the cabin in a steady stream, bringing friends and neighbors who had known Elspeth for decades. They came bearing testimonials, photographs, and most importantly, their physical presence as evidence that she was not isolated but cherished by an entire community. As the sun set behind the western peaks, Jeremiah stood on his porch and surveyed the gathering crowd of vehicles and people who had come to support their former schoolteacher. Tomorrow would bring the formal confrontation, legal arguments, expert testimony, and ultimately a judge's decision about where and how Elspeth Crane would spend her remaining years. But tonight, surrounded by the warmth of community support and the unconditional loyalty of his dogs, Jeremiah felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, the knowledge that he was no longer fighting his battles alone. The emergency guardianship hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning in the Ravalli County Courthouse, a modest building that had served the community for over a century. Judge Patricia Whitman, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the measured demeanor of someone who had presided over countless family disputes, called the case to order with a gravity that acknowledged the life-changing stakes involved. Rebecca Crane sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, James Morrison, a polished Helena lawyer who specialized in elder law and family disputes. Their case file was thick with medical evaluations, financial projections, and legal precedents supporting institutional care for individuals with cognitive impairment. On the other side of the courtroom, Marcus occupied the defendant's table with his own attorney, Sarah Chen, a local lawyer who had handled family law in the Valley for 15 years. But what made this hearing extraordinary was the packed gallery behind them, nearly 50 community members who had come to support Elspeth Crane and the unconventional care arrangement that had given her new life. Elspeth herself sat in the front row, flanked by Martha Clemens and Doc Henderson, looking more alert and composed than she had in months. Even Jeremiah's German shepherds were represented. Scout lay quietly at Elspeth's feet, having been designated as her emotional support animal for the proceedings. Judge Whitman began by addressing Elspeth directly. "Mrs. Crane, this hearing concerns your welfare and living arrangements. Do you understand what's happening today?" "Yes, Your Honor," Elspeth replied clearly. "My daughter believes I should be locked away in an institution because my mind isn't as sharp as it used to be. I believe I should have some say in where and how I spend my remaining years." Her directness seemed to surprise Judge Whitman, who consulted her notes before continuing. "The petition alleges that your current living situation is inappropriate and potentially harmful. What's your response to that?" Elspeth took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts with the careful precision of someone who knew this might be her only chance to speak for herself. "Your Honor, 6 weeks ago, I was found nearly frozen to death in the snow, confused and lost. The man who saved me could have simply called for help and walked away. Instead, he took me into his home, cared for me through a blizzard, and discovered something that no doctor or social worker had been able to provide: a place where my failing mind feels safe and peaceful." She gestured toward the crowded gallery behind her. "These people aren't strangers or paid caregivers. They're friends and neighbors who have known me for decades. They visit not because it's their job, but because they care about my well-being. When I'm confused, they help me remember who I am. When I'm frightened, they comfort me. When I'm lucid, they treat me like the person I still am inside, not just the disease I'm fighting." "Morrison?" Rebecca's attorney rose to object. "Your Honor, Mrs. Crane's emotional attachment to this arrangement doesn't address the serious safety and legal concerns at issue here." Judge Whitman held up her hand. "Let her finish." Elspeth nodded gratefully. "My daughter hasn't visited me in over 2 years. She knows nothing about my daily life, my needs, or my wishes. But she's suddenly very concerned about my welfare now that expensive care might reduce her inheritance. That's not love, Your Honor. That's greed dressed up as concern." The accusation hung in the courtroom like a thunderclap. Rebecca's face flushed with anger, and Morrison immediately objected to the characterization as prejudicial and irrelevant. But Judge Whitman seemed intrigued by the family dynamics at play. "Mrs. Rebecca Crane, you may respond to your mother's statement." Rebecca rose slowly, her professional composure clearly shaken by her mother's direct attack. "Your Honor, my mother's condition makes her prone to paranoid accusations and confused thinking. The fact that she can articulate her preferences today doesn't mean she's competent to make complex decisions about her long-term care needs." "I see. And what's your primary concern about the current arrangement?" "Safety, Your Honor. My mother is living in an isolated cabin with a man who has no medical training and no legal authority to make healthcare decisions. If she has a medical emergency, if her condition deteriorates rapidly, if she wanders off again, the potential for tragedy is enormous." Morrison stepped forward with a stack of documents. "Your Honor, we've prepared detailed comparisons between Mr. Pike's informal care arrangement and professional memory care facilities. The differences in safety protocols, medical oversight, and legal protections are stark." He began presenting charts and statistics, painting a picture of institutional care as safe, regulated, and accountable, while characterizing the mountain arrangement as well-intentioned but dangerously inadequate. But as Morrison spoke, something was happening in the courtroom that no legal brief could have anticipated. The community members in the gallery weren't simply observing, they were bearing witness. Their presence transformed the sterile legal proceedings into something more fundamental, a testament to the power of human connection and collective care. Judge Whitman seemed to sense this shift in the room's emotional temperature. "Mr. Morrison, your points about safety protocols are noted. However, I'd like to hear from some of the individuals who have been directly involved in Mrs. Crane's care." She gestured toward the gallery. "Dr. Henderson, would you approach the bench?" Doc Henderson approached the witness stand with the measured dignity of a man who had served his community for over 4 decades. His testimony was methodical and compelling, detailed medical records showing improvement in Elspeth's condition since moving to the mountain, documentation of the professional nursing care provided by Sarah Rodriguez, and most importantly, his assessment of her quality of life. "In 42 years of practice," he said, looking directly at Judge Whitman, "I've seen dozens of patients with dementia placed in institutional care. Most deteriorate rapidly, once separated from familiar environments and supportive relationships. Mrs. Crane has done the opposite. She's thrived." Morrison challenged him aggressively during cross-examination, pointing out that he wasn't a specialist in geriatric psychiatry and questioning whether emotional well-being should outweigh safety concerns. But Doc Henderson held his ground. "Safety isn't just about medical protocols and locked doors," he said firmly. "It's about creating an environment where a person feels secure enough to maintain their dignity and identity for as long as possible. Mrs. Crane has found that security on the mountain." Martha Clemens testified next, describing the network of community support that had developed around Elspeth's care. She presented a detailed schedule showing how different families rotated visits, brought meals, and provided companionship throughout each week. "This isn't one man caring for her in isolation," Martha said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had organized community efforts for decades. "This is an entire valley taking care of one of our own, the way we've always done when someone needs help." Sarah Rodriguez's testimony was perhaps the most powerful from a legal standpoint. As a licensed practical nurse, she could speak to the medical adequacy of the care arrangement while also describing the remarkable transformation she'd witnessed in Elspeth's emotional state. "I've worked in 3 different memory care facilities," she told the court. "They're clean, safe, and professionally managed. They're also soul-crushing. Patients are reduced to their diagnoses, their days structured around institutional efficiency rather than individual needs. Mrs. Crane hasn't just maintained her dignity in the mountain setting, she's reclaimed parts of herself that I thought were lost forever." But it was Reverend Thomas's testimony that seemed to affect Judge Whitman most deeply. The elderly minister spoke about visiting Elspeth regularly, engaging her in theological discussions that revealed the continuing sharpness of her spiritual and intellectual life. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent counseling families through difficult times, "we're not just talking about where Mrs. Crane will live. We're talking about how she'll die. In an institution, surrounded by strangers and regulated by bureaucratic schedules, or in a place where she's loved and valued for who she still is. Not just managed because of what she's lost." Morrison tried to undermine each testimony, arguing that emotional appeals couldn't override legal requirements and safety standards. He called his own expert witness, a geriatrician from Missoula who had never examined Elspeth but spoke authoritatively about the risks of home care for dementia patients. "The statistical evidence is clear," the expert testified. "Individuals with moderate to severe cognitive impairment are significantly safer in specialized facilities with trained staff and proper security measures." But when Judge Whitman asked if he'd reviewed the specific care plan and community support system in place for Elspeth, the expert admitted he had not. The turning point came when Judge Whitman called Jeremiah to testify. He approached the stand with obvious reluctance, unused to being the center of attention and uncomfortable with formal legal proceedings. "Mr. Pike," Judge Whitman began, "you've heard testimony about Mrs. Crane's medical care, community support, and emotional well-being. But I want to hear from you personally. Why did you take on this responsibility?" Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was steady but filled with emotion. 20 years ago, I lost my wife and daughter in an accident. I came to the mountain to hide from that pain, to avoid ever caring about anyone again. For 2 decades, I succeeded. He looked toward Elspeth, who was watching him with complete attention. Then, this woman appeared in my life. Lost and confused and needing help, my dogs found her first, surrounded her, protected her, brought her warmth when she was dying of cold. He paused, struggling with words that had never come easily. I could have just called for rescue and walked away. But something about her dignity in the face of confusion, her gratitude despite her fear, reminded me of what it meant to be human. Not just to exist, but to care for someone other than yourself. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly. "And now, what does caring for Mrs. Crane mean to you now?" "It means having a purpose beyond my own pain. It means being responsible for someone else's happiness and dignity. It means learning that love doesn't always have to be mutual to be worthwhile. Sometimes it's enough to simply offer it freely, without expecting anything in return." Morrison objected that the testimony was irrelevant to the legal questions at hand, but Judge Whitman overruled him. "Mr. Pike," she continued, "caring for someone with dementia will only get more difficult. Are you prepared for that reality?" Jeremiah nodded slowly. "I'm prepared to try, Your Honor. With the help of this community, I'm prepared to make sure she never feels abandoned or forgotten, no matter how confused her mind becomes." In the gallery, Elspeth smiled through tears, while Rebecca Crane stared at her hands, perhaps finally understanding what she was truly trying to destroy. Judge Whitman recessed the hearing for 2 hours to review testimony and consider her decision. The waiting felt interminable. Community members gathered in small groups outside the courthouse, speaking in hushed tones about the testimony they'd witnessed and the life-changing decision that hung in the balance. Elspeth remained remarkably calm during the recess, sitting on a bench in the courthouse corridor with Scout at her feet and Jeremiah beside her. She seemed more present and alert than she had in weeks, as if the gravity of the situation had sharpened her focus in ways that ordinary days could not. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I want you to know that these past weeks on the mountain have been the happiest I've known since Thomas died. You gave me back something I thought was lost forever, the feeling of being valued for who I am, not pitied for what I've become." Jeremiah took her hand, surprised by the steady strength in her grip. "You gave me something too. You reminded me that isolation isn't the same as peace, and that caring for someone else might be the only way to truly heal." When court reconvened, Judge Whitman's expression was grave, but not unkind. She had clearly wrestled with a decision that involved not just legal precedent, but fundamental questions about human dignity and the right to choose one's own path through decline and aging. "This case presents an unusual set of circumstances," she began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "On one hand, we have legitimate concerns about the safety and welfare of an elderly woman with cognitive impairment. On the other hand, we have compelling evidence of a care arrangement that has not only met her medical needs, but has demonstrably improved her quality of life." She looked directly at Rebecca, who sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table. "Miss Rebecca Crane, your concern for your mother's welfare is noted, but the court finds your extended absence from her life and your focus on financial implications troubling. Love and duty cannot be exercised selectively or from a distance." Rebecca's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but she remained silent as the judge continued. Mr. Marcus Crane, the court recognizes your genuine devotion to your mother's well-being and your willingness to support an unconventional but effective care arrangement. Your petition to maintain guardianship is granted. A wave of relief swept through the courtroom gallery, but Judge Whitman held up her hand for continued silence. However, she continued, this arrangement will be subject to quarterly reviews by social services. Professional medical oversight must continue, and any deterioration in Mrs. Crane's condition that compromises her safety will require immediate reassessment of the living situation. She turned to address Elspeth directly. Mrs. Crane, you have expressed clear preferences about your care, and while your cognitive condition may progress, you retain the right to make decisions about your life as long as you're competent to do so. The court finds that you are currently competent and that your choice to remain in Mr. Pike's care, supported by your community, should be respected. Finally, Judge Whitman looked at Jeremiah with an expression that might have been admiration. Mr. Pike, you have undertaken a significant responsibility. The court trusts that you understand the commitment you've made, not just to Mrs. Crane's physical welfare, but to honoring her dignity and autonomy throughout whatever challenges lie ahead. The gavel came down with a finality that settled the legal questions while opening the door to an uncertain but hopeful future. Outside the courthouse, the celebration was subdued but genuine. Community members embraced Elspeth and Jeremiah, expressing relief and pledging continued support. Even some who had initially doubted the wisdom of the mountain arrangement now seemed convinced by the testimony they'd heard. Rebecca Crane left immediately after the hearing, her lawyer in tow, without speaking to her mother or brother. The sight of her rental SUV disappearing down the highway felt like the closing of a chapter that had never brought anyone joy. That evening, back on the mountain, a different kind of gathering took place around the fireplace in Jeremiah's cabin. Marcus, Doc Henderson, Martha Clemens, Sarah Rodriguez, and Reverend Thomas shared a simple dinner, discussing practical plans for the continued care arrangement and reflecting on the day's extraordinary events. You know what struck me most about today? Martha said, stirring honey into her tea. It wasn't just about Elspeth's right to choose where she lives. It was about what happens when a community decides to take care of its own instead of delegating that responsibility to strangers. Doc Henderson nodded thoughtfully. We've lost something important in our modern approach to aging and illness, the understanding that caring for our elderly and infirm is a privilege, not a burden. Today, we reclaimed that understanding. As the visitors gradually departed and the cabin settled into its evening quiet, Elspeth sat in her familiar chair by the fire. With Scout at her feet and a book of poetry open in her lap, she looked up as Jeremiah added another log to the fire, the flames casting warm light across her serene features. "Thank you," she said simply, "not just for today, but for showing me that it's possible to find home in the most unexpected places." Jeremiah settled into his own chair, Kaiser and Ranger arranging themselves nearby with the satisfied air of dogs whose pack was complete and secure. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of changing seasons and the eternal rhythms of the natural world. He opened his leather journal for what would be one of his final entries as a man living alone. The pages that followed would document not solitude but shared life, not isolation but community, not the careful avoidance of love but its daily practice in all its complicated, rewarding, heartbreaking forms. Sometimes, he wrote, salvation comes not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet decision to let someone else matter more than your own fear of loss. Tonight, surrounded by the warmth of unexpected family, I understand finally that the opposite of grief is not the absence of love, but the courage to love again, knowing full well that all love leads eventually to loss, and that the loss is always, always worth it. Through the window, the first stars were appearing in the clear mountain sky, distant lights that had guided travelers for countless generations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight there was peace, purpose, and the simple joy of knowing that even the most guarded hearts could learn, eventually, to open again.